when John and Douglas Murray and these people say, oh, we've been on the ground in Gaza. Yeah, as guests of the Israeli military that's doing the killing, starving and maiming, and you've come...
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Really appreciate you stopping by today. So in this video, we're watching Mehdi Hasan go head-to-head with military analyst John Spencer in what becomes an absolutely intense exchange about the conflict in the region and whether certain actions cross legal and moral lines. What makes this particularly compelling is that even the moderator, Piers Morgan, shifts his entire position during this conversation in a way I've genuinely never seen before. The evidence presented here gets so overwhelming that positions people held for months start falling apart in real time. Make sure you stick around because the second half of this is where things get really heated, and you'll see why some arguments just can't survive when the facts start piling up. Before we jump in, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I always love seeing where everyone's tuning in from around the world. All right, let's get into this.
Institute. Okay, let's get into this. Mehdi, welcome back to Uncensored. Listen, you and I have talked about this war in Gaza for ever since it started, this phase of the 75-year conflict. And I have resisted going as far as you have done in your criticism of the Israeli government. I resist no more. I think we've reached common ground about what we view is happening and has been happening through this period of this blockade, which frankly is just starvation of the people there, including so many innocent young women and children. And I think that the incessant bombing and killing, and we don't know how many civilians have been killed, but it is on a daily basis. It looks like hundreds of people every day, with no apparent attempt, it seems to me, to have any real plan for how this ends or what happens when it ends, other than if you look at what Smotrich has been saying, probably the most right-wing member of a very right-wing government, he is talking in a genocidal language about kicking all the Palestinians out. So I think you and I have reached a place in the last few weeks where we are in agreement. But my question for you, Mehdi, is how does this end?
I don't know the answer to that question, Piers, and I'm glad we're in agreement. I wish we weren't. Actually, I wish I had been wrong and you were right. I wish that a year ago when I said on your show, you said, well, if it's not about the hostages, what's it about? And I said, it's about depopulating Gaza. It's about conquering Gaza. I wish I'd been wrong. But as you said, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister in the Israeli government, said this week, we are there to conquer, cleanse, and remain. Those are his words. We are disassembling Gaza, he said. We are leaving it as piles of rubble. He says, we're doing something that no one's done in the world before. He bragged out loud, and he said, yes, the Gazans will have to leave. So all of those things are stuff some of us were saying last year. I wish we hadn't been vindicated in this horrific way. The killing is ongoing. The starvation is ongoing. And look, I do hope that a dam is bursting. You mentioned the genocide word. Shmuel Lederman, who is an Israeli researcher of genocide, spent much of 2024 saying it's not a genocide, it's not a genocide. He was interviewed by a Dutch newspaper last week. He said, I've changed my position. It is a genocide. He said, in my field, there's a consensus among genocide scholars that it's a genocide. In fact, that Dutch newspaper interviewed 7 leading scholars of genocide. Every single one said, we think what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. In fact, this week, Piers, you have an Israeli former general, Yair Golan, saying a sane country does not attack civilians, does not kill babies as a hobby, and does not expel civilian populations. That is Yair Golan, the former deputy chief of the Israeli military, prominent Israeli politician. He was a hero on October the 7th, fought Hamas himself on October the 7th. This is what he said this week.
Okay, John Spencer, you've been kind of pulling a lot of faces there. You obviously don't agree. But given that so many allies of Israel are now raising massive alarm bells about what is happening, you can't be comfortable, surely, with what is going on in Gaza, are you?
Absolutely not. I think it's horrible. I think there are people suffering. I just am not misinformed on who is the cause of that suffering, that it isn't Israel, that war isn't a crime. War should be avoided at all costs, and Israel did that. And this war didn't start 75 years ago. This war started on October 7th when Hamas invaded Israel and tried to destroy and actually did genocidal acts. I agree that there's a lot of suffering happening in Gaza, and it's the list of people who are responsible. Israel's not on it in my list. Hamas is on it, and I actually have solutions. You asked Mehdi for a solution. I have solutions based on the history of war. Number one solution is to encourage Egypt to open the gate that they control and create a humanitarian zone. Let every woman, child, and elderly person out of Gaza, just like you and I have discussed in the past about Ukraine. 5 million women, children, elderly left Ukraine to escape Russia's evil and bombardments. That could be done today, and it's criminal that it hasn't happened today. Now, Mehdi uses experts, although I thought, credentialism and expert theory was a bad thing today. I've been on the ground, although I've heard that that's a bad thing as well. And what's missing here is, again, which is why I was shaking my head, is that you believe, based on statements of politicians that are not the actual government and the decision makers of the institution, that Israel is intentionally causing this harm. That's false as well. Point the finger at Hamas, as you've said in the past, Piers, and I'm sorry we've lost you. Maybe you and I can.
This is one of those moments where you watch someone's entire position crumble in real time. Piers Morgan just said, "I resist no more." Think about that for a second. This is the same guy who spent months pushing back against Mehdi, defending certain actions, trying to stay balanced. And now he's saying this blockade is just starvation of the people there, including so many innocent young women and children. That's not a small shift. That's a total reversal. And here's why this matters so much. When someone like Piers finally admits what's been happening, it means the evidence became so overwhelming that even people trying their hardest to stay neutral couldn't ignore it anymore. He's not some activist. He's not coming from one side or the other. He tried to hold the middle ground for as long as humanly possible, but reality has a way of breaking through eventually. Now watch what Mehdi does next. He doesn't gloat. He doesn't do a victory lap. He says, "I wish I had been wrong." And that tells you everything about what kind of argument this actually is. Because a year ago on this same show, Mehdi said it's about depopulating the area. It's about conquering the region. And people called him extreme. They said he was exaggerating. They said he was being unfair. But then the Israeli Finance Minister himself comes out and says we are there to conquer, cleanse, and remain. Those are his exact words, not Mehdi's interpretation, not some biased translation. The actual policymaker in the government saying the quiet part out loud. When the people in power start admitting what critics have been saying all along, that's when you know the mask has completely come off. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because it's not just one official. Mehdi mentions how an Israeli researcher who studies this stuff spent all of 2024 saying it's not what people claimed. Then last week, he reversed his position entirely and said there's actually consensus among scholars in his field. When experts who initially defended something flip their position, you have to ask yourself what evidence made them change their mind.
Go to Gaza because it's not true.
Well, actually, it's interesting. I mean, look, just on that, John. Look, you haven't lost me. I still think Hamas is a terrorist organization which committed one of the worst terrorist crimes of the last century, and they should absolutely no longer have any power in that region. They should absolutely be dismantled as a political force and the rest of it. I just see no evidence that Israel's mission statement to eradicate Hamas has worked. In fact, conversely, more and more reports are coming out that for every Hamas terrorist who's been killed, they're being replaced by 4 or 5 people who share that ideology. So the mission statement isn't working. And you say that Israel is not intentionally killing innocent people, but it knows it is killing a lot of innocent people. So its argument is we're going after Hamas, they're embedded in civilian populations, but they are killing a lot of innocent civilians every single day. And not just killing them, they're now starving them, which will also lead to deaths, which is a deliberate, willful act of trying to kill people. Would you accept that?
It's a war crime.
No, not at all. No. I mean,
starving people?
You can have your own opinions based on your assessment. Yeah, absolutely not starving people. So you're talking about the last 2 months of trucks not going in because Hamas was diverting it. Although the 42 days prior to that, 25,000 trucks went into Gaza. There is absolutely people hungry in Gaza. But Israel is not intentionally starving civilians. Is it trying to starve Hamas combatants in this war that was started on October 7th? No. The evidence doesn't show that. This is the lies, damn lies of statistics and using certain organizations that are using trusted agents. Here's a good, for instance, recently, Mehdi put on a British doctor in southern Gaza on his show. Maybe you've had him on, and he's talking about how bad the hospitals are. He's sitting in the European hospital in southern Gaza, where they just killed Mohammed Sinwar, who was in a tunnel underneath the hospital. This double standard about Israel, this double standard about war is problematic, Piers, and here's why. is we're going to validate the practice of taking hostages. We're going to validate the use of your own population as human shields, because that's what Hamas is doing. Now, innocent civilians, of course, innocent civilians have died because Hamas does things like not let them evacuate when they're told to evacuate, like actually holding children in their arms while they shoot at the IDF. And again, we can go, and Mehdi can probably go with Al Jazeera to the Hamas side and look for ourselves on what you think Israel is trying to do. I also have well, what did you want Israel to do on October 7th? And had the world not stopped and done things like don't go to Rafah where the hostages are, where Yahya Sinwar is, that this war would be over by now.
Okay, I'll bring Mehdi to respond. I mean, the one thing I would say is Israel's ongoing refusal to allow international journalists to operate freely in Gaza is a suppression of us uncovering the reality. You say come into Gaza.
That's
actually
not true.
Is
Fox News.
No. Israel
Trey Yanks,
Israel has
CNN.
barred almost every international journalist from getting anywhere near it. You know that, and I know that, and it's
I'll be there for my sixth time next month.
It's unprecedented for international journalists to be banned in this way from a war zone. It's unprecedented, and it does beg the question, John, why? Now, Mehdi, your response to what John has said there.
Now, here's where things get really interesting. John Spencer starts arguing that the people suffering aren't suffering because of certain military actions, and Piers immediately pushes back. He says Israel is not intentionally hurting innocent people, but it knows it is hurting a lot of innocent people. And then he goes even further. He says they're now starving them, which will also lead to loss of life, which is a deliberate, willful act. That's not activist language. That's Piers Morgan calling it what it is. John tries to deflect by talking about aid trucks and saying the other side diverted supplies. But here's the thing about that argument. Even if you accept that premise, it doesn't change the fundamental question Piers is asking. If you know your actions are causing mass starvation, and you continue those actions anyway, what does that make you? Because intent in war isn't just about what you say you're trying to do. It's about what you know will happen as a result of your choices. And then John says Israel is not intentionally starving civilians. But Piers just spent 2 minutes explaining how blocking food and supplies from getting to a population that includes massive numbers of children is intentional starvation. You can't accidentally blockade an entire region. You can't accidentally prevent humanitarian aid from entering. Those are active choices with predictable outcomes. This is the same pattern we've seen throughout history. When governments commit terrible acts, they always claim it's not intentional. They say we're targeting the bad guys, and unfortunately, civilians get caught in the crossfire. But when the civilian casualties become the majority of casualties, when entire neighborhoods get flattened, when aid gets systematically blocked, at what point does accidental become a convenient lie? And here's what really exposes the whole thing. Piers brings up how international journalists aren't allowed to operate freely in the conflict zone. If everything is justified and legal and proportionate, why ban the press? Why prevent independent verification? When governments block journalists from documenting what's happening, it's usually because they don't want the world to see what they're actually doing.
I mean, I don't know how I can respond. So much gaslighting from the very beginning. John has been on the ground in Gaza, yeah, as an embed. I love it when John and Douglas Murray and these people say, oh, we've been on the ground in Gaza. Yeah, as guests of the Israeli military that's doing the killing, starving and maiming. And you've come back and done exactly what they wanted to do. You've done their propaganda for them. Journalists have not been allowed freely into Gaza. That's why every major media organization on planet Earth has said to the Israeli government, you must allow journalists in. The Palestinian journalists who are there have been killed in record numbers. Of course, Piers, you're right. They want to hide what they're doing. That's why they're killing the journalists there and blocking the journalists from coming in. This idea that he's been on the ground. Yeah, I did interview a doctor, a British plastic surgeon, Dr. Tom Patoka. And by the way, he wasn't in the European hospital because the hospital got bombed by Israel. So he was in another hospital, and he talked to me about how he has to treat patients who have maggots in their wounds. He has to treat patients without limbs. He has to treat children. I've interviewed multiple doctors on the ground in Gaza, actually in Gaza, not hanging around with Israeli military. And they've all said the same thing, American doctors, British British doctors, Canadian doctors. They've all talked about how many kids they saw with sniper bullets to the head and chest. Israel does intentionally kill civilians. That's why Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant were indicted at the International Criminal Court for precisely those charges, for willful killing of Palestinians, for murder and persecution. That's why they've been indicted. That's why every human rights group in the world says war crimes are being committed. They've killed people holding white flags. We've seen it with our own eyes. They've bombed buildings without warning with families inside, like the Al-Dos family that I often cite in October 2023. They've dropped 2,000-pound bombs on refugee camps full of hundreds of people. They have killed 7 aid workers in a clearly marked World Central Kitchen aid convoy. They've bombed World Food Programme convoys, leading to Cindy McCain, the wife of the most pro-Israeli senator of my lifetime, to come out and condemn Israel for attacking aid workers.
This is the moment that destroys John Spencer's entire credibility in this debate. Mehdi says, "I love it when John and Douglas Murray say, 'Oh, we've been on the ground in the conflict zone.' Yeah, as guests of the military force that's doing the operations. And you've come back and done exactly what they wanted. You've done their propaganda for them. That's not just a burn. That's a complete exposure of how embedded journalism works. When you go somewhere as a guest of one side in a conflict, you only see what they want you to see. You only go where they take you. You only speak to people they approve. And then you come back and present yourself as some kind of neutral observer who's been on the ground. It's propaganda with extra steps." And Mehdi doesn't just leave it at that. He brings up how he actually interviewed doctors. British doctors, American doctors, Canadian doctors, people who went there to provide medical care, not to do PR for anyone. And every single one of them talked about how many kids they saw with projectile wounds to the head and chest. Those are medical professionals giving testimony about what they personally treated. That's evidence. That's documentation. That's not bias or propaganda. Then he mentions how the leader and the defense official were indicted at the International Criminal Court for intentional harm to civilians, for willful actions, for persecution. When the international legal system that we created after the worst conflicts in human history looks at what's happening and says, this crosses the line, you can't just dismiss that as political bias. These are the same courts and legal frameworks that judged war criminals from every other conflict. And here's where the evidence becomes absolutely undeniable. Mehdi lists specific incidents. They dropped 2,000-pound ordnance on refugee camps full of hundreds of people. They targeted 7 aid workers in a clearly marked humanitarian convoy. They hit World Food Program vehicles. And the result, even Cindy McCain, whose husband was one of the most supportive American politicians of the other side, came out and condemned the attacks on aid workers. When you start losing people who have been your strongest defenders, when the wife of someone known for decades of support speaks out against you, that tells you something fundamental has changed. Because these aren't people looking for reasons to criticize. These are people who gave every possible benefit of the doubt and finally reached a point where they couldn't justify what they were seeing anymore. This whole debate shows you how narratives eventually collapse under the weight of evidence. You can control the message for a while. You can limit journalist access. You can have friendly commentators do media tours. But eventually, the doctors start talking. The aid workers start talking. Your own officials start saying the quiet part out loud. And people who desperately wanted to believe the official story realize they can't anymore. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.